So, were you successful? Let's try this together now. And for this, in the source folder next to the components folder, I will add a hooks folder. This is just a convention, not something you have to do. You can name it differently, but I will follow this common convention. And then add a new file in there, which I'll name use.http.js. Again, this name is also up to you, but since I will create a HTTP related custom hook in there, I think this is a fitting name. Now the hook function itself, I will call that use HTTP, following this must use pattern where your custom hook functions must start with the word use. And I will export this custom hook here because of course I want to be able to use it in other files. Now, regarding the content of this function, as I said, there will be more than one solution, and definitely feel free to share your alternatives in the Q&A section if you want to. I'm just showing you one possible approach which I came up with. And for that, let's have a look at the general logic we want to outsource. In the end, it is the loading and the error state, but then also the entire code where we send the request, where we evaluate the response, all of that should be outsourced. Also this error handling here, where we then set the error state, that all should be part of the custom hook. And therefore, I think it is reasonable to go to the app component and grab this entire fetch tasks function and grab these states here, and in the end copy that into use HTTP into this custom hook function. Now here we can get rid of this tasks state here because that's a bit too specific. That's specific to the app component. That's not something I would want to put in the use HTTP custom hook itself, because this hook should not just be usable with tasks, but with any kind of data. But I will definitely keep the loading and error state in there. Now, of course, to use state in this file, as always, we should import use state from React. And I will rename this function here from fetch tasks to send request, so that this has a more generic name, because we will also tweak the logic in there to be more generic. This custom hook should not just be dealing with fetching data. It should also not just be dealing with fetching tasks specifically, because otherwise this hook would not be very reusable. It would be basically limited to one operation, fetching tasks. And that's not what I want here. Instead, this hook should be able to send any kind of request to any kind of URL and do any kind of data transformation, but it should always manage the same state, loading and error, and execute the same steps in the same order. That's the actual reusage we want here. And to make that hook that flexible, we of course also will need some parameters here. We will need some parameters to configure this hook. And what should be configurable here? Well, I would say the request logic. That needs to be configurable. The URL, but also the method, the body, the headers. This all needs to be flexible. So I do expect a request config parameter here. And this in turn then should be an object, let's say, which contains the URL and any kind of other configuration that might be needed. Now therefore, here, I will get rid of that URL of that hard-coded string here in use HTTP and instead refer to request_config.url. Since we will be calling that hook, we then have to make sure that we pass in an object which has a URL property which holds the URL. This hook should also be usable for post requests, so therefore fetch should take a second argument here. And then there I pass my object where the method should be set to request_config.method, where the headers should be set to request_config.headers, and where the body should be set to JSON stringify request_config.body, so that we perform the JSON transformation inside of the hook but the body itself is passed in from outside. And again, this is really just my approach here. You could make this more reusable, you could expect different parameters. That's all up to you. This is just one possible solution. Now this request and how this request is being sent is a bit more configurable. Of course, I want to then check the response like this, and I want to transform the response like this. I am assuming here that we're always working with JSON data, so I will not make this hook super generic to work with any kind of data. I will limit it to JSON data, because everything else would be far beyond the scope of this course. And therefore, I will keep these steps here, but the transformation and so on, and what we do with the data in the end, that, of course, is then, again, highly specific and not something that should be part of this hook. Instead, I would imagine that we get the data here, and then maybe we execute a function which we get from the component that uses the hook, and pass that data to that function, so that the concrete transformation steps can be defined in the component where this hook is being used. So therefore here, instead of executing this code, I do expect to get another parameter here, and that's the, let's say, apply data function. The name is up to you. And then here, once we got the data, we simply call apply data and pass the data to it. So that in the hook, we just hand the data off to this apply data function, and the function itself and what happens in there is provided by the component that uses the custom hook. So that we have that reusability and that reused logic in the hook, but the specific steps that should be taken with the data in the component that uses the hook. This is a split which makes sense to me. Now, with that, we got the loading and the error state and the send request function in the custom hook, but ultimately these are all things which we will need in the component that uses the hook. That component should then have access to the loading and the error state, and it should have access to the send request function so that it's the component which can trigger send request. Therefore, at the end of the custom hook, not at the end of send request, but at the end of the custom hook function, I want to return something to the component where the custom hook is used. And I mentioned before in this module that your custom hooks, of course, can return anything. Numbers, strings, arrays, objects. And here I will return an object. And there I will add a isLoading property, which points at the isLoading state constant. So this is the property name on the left side. This is the value on the right side. And that isLoading state, which is managed for the component by this custom hook. And I will also return an object with an error property, which holds the error state, just as the loading state. And then the send request property, which points at send request. So at this function here. And since I'm always using the same property names as variable names on the right side, we can also use a modern JavaScript shortcut here where we write this like that. That's the same result, or that will give us the same result as the code I had a couple of seconds ago. It's just a bit shorter, and it will be transformed to that longer syntax under the hood by JavaScript. So that's a shortcut we can use in modern JavaScript. And with that, we got our custom hook, at least the first version of it. Now let's see how we could use this custom hook.